Good evening or good afternoon, I'm not quite sure where we are. My name's John Williams, I'm the Executive Dean of the Faculty, and it gives me immense pleasure to introduce my friend Tim Reeves. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of the Kaurna people and we pay our respects to their leaders. And we also note that the university is working closely with our colleagues to create the next generation of learning deriving from the Kaurna people, and we acknowledge that the university has its campuses on their lands. I'd also like to also note an apology from Greg Mackey, the CEO of the History Trust of South Australia, who would be here today. Unfortunately, he's suffering from COVID, and we wish him the best in his recovery. Let me start by saying something about Tim. Tim holds a Bachelor of Arts, a joint first class from History and Politics from this university. I was attempting to remember when I recalled when I first met Tim, and it was some time ago, I think in 2014. Our meeting was either as my role as the Director of the South Australian Law Reform Institute or as the Dean of the Law School at the University of Adelaide. With the greatly missed Ian Purcell AM, Tim provided invaluable support and perspective as we reviewed those laws that had a discriminatory effect on the LGBTIQ community of South Australia. It was at the same time I was investigating how the Adelaide Law School could provide greater acknowledgement for Dr Duncan. Tim was a natural collaborator and advisor. Tim has published widely, and his books and articles deal with such diverse topics as Canberra architecture, house design competition, and of course, Dr Duncan. Today we will hear more from that last topic as he leads us through this gripping and this tragic account of the death of Dr Duncan. Tim's work on this topic has marked him out as the leading scholar in the area, and he is published widely, nationally and internationally in all journals and outlets. He was the historian consultant for Watershed, the oratorio that recently commissioned and beautifully presented, I might say, at the Adelaide Festival. As you know, Tim, with his publisher Wakefield Press, has released The Death of Dr Duncan, the book you probably saw on the way in. This is a meticulously researched book which essentially is the essential companion as we walk through the terrible events that we are acknowledging today. I thank Tim for his work on the life and the death of Dr Duncan. I would argue that this work is perhaps the most significant book to be published on South Australian history this year. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Tim.
Thank you, John, and good evening. Can people hear me up the back? All okay? You'll have to excuse me, I look like I'm kind of a bit over wide, but this is what we need. We need two microphones tonight. I'll try not to strangle myself on the wires while I'm talking to you. In the preparation of this talk, I am grateful to the wonderful staff at the History Trust of South Australia and the University of Adelaide. And it is especially significant for me to be here at my alma mater, in fact, the very institution, as John just said, where I wrote my honours thesis on Dr Duncan 30 years ago. Of course, it was also the University of Adelaide that brought Duncan to the city to take up a lectureship in its law school, and where he first started teaching on Monday, the 27th of March, 1972. Little knowing that within 7 weeks he would be dead on Wednesday, the 10th of May, and for which occurred during first term break. No one would report him missing, which is really sad. And here we are now commemorating, indeed, to within the next 5.5 hours, the 50th anniversary of his senseless killing, a killing for which his attackers remain unconvicted, for which suspicions of police involvement have not been dulled by time, and I would argue never will. Tonight, I want to talk to you about Duncan's death and its ramifications for gay law reform. It is a story that, as the flyer for the book says, is both disturbing and captivating. Dr Duncan and the events triggered by his death are featured in the Wakefield Companion to South Australian History, the Australian Dictionary of Biography, and the Who's Who in Contemporary Gay and Lesbian History. So it is known at a state, national, and even international level. However, it is one of the many ironies of the Duncan case that this public recognition is something he would have abhorred. He was an extremely shy, intensely private and taciturn man who probably would have remained a closeted homosexual his whole life, and yet he has become a gay martyr, a queer icon in modern parlance. As I state in the conclusion to the book, I can hear him muttering darkly from the grave at the use of such labels. We're going to want to show videos soon, and I don't know if we've got the tech people here to organise that. Yep, they are great. So what we're going to do is show you a 1972 report from the ABC television program This Day Tonight. It runs for about 4 minutes and sets the scene for my talk. Early on, you will see the retrieval of Duncan's body from the River Torrens, which occurred around 9:15 a.m. on the morning after his death. At this point, his body has lain on the riverbed for about 10 hours. Good Lord, there's that car. And rigor mortis has set in, a warning that this element may be distressing for people to watch.
It was here, on the banks of the Torrens in central Adelaide, that Dr Duncan met his death late at night on May the 10th. Very little is known about Dr Duncan. He came to Australia in March as an immigrant and to join the Department of Law at the University of Adelaide. He knew few people, he liked to be alone, eat alone, and he was a homosexual. The details of what happened that night were pieced together by the Adelaide coroner, who found that the cause of Dr Duncan's death by drowning was due to violence on the part of persons of whose identity there was no evidence. It was on pathologist's evidence that the coroner accepted that Dr Duncan was a homosexual. Under government instructions, he allowed homosexuals who said they were on the riverbank that night to give evidence in camera, so that they could be neither named nor identified. Evidence they did give revealed that about 10:30 p.m, 2 homosexuals quarrelled in a toilet. On leaving the toilet, one chased the other. And at about this time, according to the evidence of 3 young men sitting in a car, 4 or 5 homosexuals were chasing each other around these boat sheds. While they did so, the witnesses said, a car pulled up that looked like a police car. A uniformed police officer told the inquest that he met a constable from the vice squad who used a 4-letter word to tell him to clear off. Another witness, a man identified only as Mr. X, told the inquest that on the same night at the same spot he'd been seized by 2 men and flung down these concrete steps and into the river. And it was shortly after this that Dr Duncan suffered a similar fate. Later, police inquiries revealed that members of the vice squad were in the area at the time of Dr Duncan's death, after attending a retirement party for one of their colleagues at a nearby hotel. And earlier this month, almost 2 months after the incident, 3 vice squad members, Constables Corley, Clayton and Hudson, were suspended from the force. While the police investigation goes on, several things have happened. The University of Adelaide's council met at the weekend and expressed grave disquiet at the circumstances surrounding the Duncan affair. One academic, Dr. E.H. Medlin, said he too had been attacked on the banks of the Torrens, and he believed his attacker was a member of the vice squad. This sort of thing, he said, has been happening as long as I can remember. Should homosexuals have to meet furtively at night in places like this because of the existing law? Murray Hill is a member of the South Australian Parliament and the first politician in this country to move to change the law. What do you intend to do, Mr. Hill?
Well, the proposed bill will alter the present law so that 2 and no more than 2 adult consenting males who live privately will no longer be criminals, as they are throughout Australia at the present time.
And you're introducing a private members bill?
Yes, this is a matter which is usually done by private members' legislation or private members' bills. Any social legislation of a rather radical kind is usually introduced in that way.
Do you expect the Dunstan government to support you?
Well, I don't know what the government will do, but I would think that a bill of this kind would be treated as an open vote and that each member will vote according to his or her conscience.
You're not a homosexual yourself?
No.
Are you in touch with them? I mean, have they come to you for
Well,
help?
some people have phoned me, who I believe, of course, are. But most of the people that have been in touch with me are younger people in their 20s and 30s, solicitors and psychologists and teachers who have grouped together to see whether this law, which is considered in this one respect to be a very unjust law, can be changed.
That chilling footage of Duncan's body being dredged from the river came from Channel 7 and was later spliced into the ABC story. The cameraman arrived late and Duncan's body was returned to the water to be hauled out again for filming. Police apparently thought it was a drunk who had fallen in. A drunk or not, the treatment by police of a corpse in this way is an appalling act of desecration. As you also saw in that story, it is an inescapable fact of history that Duncan's death was the catalyst for the first parliamentary attempt to decriminalise male homosexual acts in this state and this nation. That bill was watered down by an amendment, and another attempt was made in 1973, which failed by one vote, until success came with the third attempt in 1975. And the result was groundbreaking legislation. It was the first in the English-speaking world to eliminate any distinction between man and woman and heterosexual and homosexual, and included an equal age of consent. Another measure of the advanced nature of this reform is that Tasmania was the last jurisdiction in Australia to enact change, and it took a further 22 years, not until 1997. However, Dr Duncan may well have been written out of gay history if Don Dunstan had had his way. A decade earlier, in 1965, when he was Attorney General, Dunstan secured cabinet agreement to introduce a decriminalisation bill. In fact, it was one of his first initiatives on appointment. But while initially approved by the Labor caucus, some members then withdrew their support. A nationwide survey 2 years later confirmed what they suspected. Less than a quarter of respondents favoured liberalisation of the law. Male homosexuality was still a major social taboo in Australia, which could condemn such men to a life of fear and self-loathing. They could be disowned by their family, ostracised by their friends, sacked by their employer, or evicted by their landlord. If brought before the courts, they could be imprisoned, or worse, with their name published in the press, take their own lives. You may have noticed my use of the term male homosexual acts. This is because the criminal law has never been codified against male homosexuality as such. Its focus has always been on specific sexual behaviour. And at the top of this list is anal sex, or buggery, or sodomy, as it was often referred to in law. Buggery was first criminalised in English law by Henry VIII in 1533, so nearly half a millennium ago. Britain embraced decriminalisation before Australia in 1967, but for centuries the criminal statutes were very clear about buggery and very punitive. In the beginning, it was punishable by death, and this is the law that the colonists brought with them to this country. It was not until 1859 that the death penalty was removed in South Australia, although it had never been used. Over time, the penalty was reduced, initially to from 10 years to life imprisonment, although this included hard labour and even allowed for flogging, and later to a maximum of 10 years. Key changes to South Australian law meant that by 1935, attempting to procure or committing a male homosexual act, whether in public or private, was outlawed. These were the restrictions in place when Dr. Duncan arrived. Other countries had found far more sensible ways of dealing with the issue. For example, homosexual relations between two or more, consenting men in private have been entirely legal in France for over 2 centuries, since 1791. But decriminalisation does not necessarily lead to sexual freedom. Homosexual men continued to be harassed throughout the 19th and 20th centuries in France, which reached a peak when new laws were introduced by the Vichy regime during World War II. There are echoes in Germany when, after its own murderous treatment of homosexual men during the war, it took decades to remove discriminatory legislation from its statute books. The pink triangle is a signal reminder of the horrors of the concentration camps, but it's not as if the vilification of homosexuals ended when the last camp was closed. And as an aside, there is a 1981 novel based on the Duncan murder, and it is called The Pink Triangle. Before returning to Dr. Duncan, I should clarify that female homosexual acts have never come under the purview of the criminal law in Britain or Australia. For a long time, it was believed that this was helped by Queen Victoria, who refused to accept that such a thing as a lesbian even existed, but it now seems that story was apocryphal. Now, to lead up to the events of 10 May 1972, it was cruelly ironic that Duncan had recently arrived from a country, and the mother country no less, where male homosexual acts had been decriminalised 5 years earlier. It was doubly cruelly ironic that he was a lecturer in law and would be teaching legal history in the position he had recently taken up. He previously had been working part-time at the University of Bristol, but he was not regarded as someone who developed a good rapport with students, and he left after 5 years. His parents and a half-sister were dead. He had become an orphan at 21, which made him financially independent. He travelled first class by sea, in the days when you did that, from Britain at the university's expense, and was met on arrival by his head of department, Horst Lücker. And there is his passenger arrival card, which is held at the National Archives. And you might note his rather awkward signature at the base of that document. Duncan had applied for and then turned down the job when it was offered to him, before changing his mind and accepting. So the course of gay law reform in South Australia and Australia very nearly took a different path, let alone that aged 91, he may still be alive. As noted, he was exceedingly shy and reserved, although he had circles of friends in Britain, and not so shy that he expected Professor Lücker to address him with the same title when Duncan was on the base academic rung of lecturer, bizarre behaviour which Lücker tried to change without success. Duncan rented a 2-bedroom flat at Lincoln College in North Adelaide and bought a car, a white Vauxhall Viva, we know that now, which was later found parked on King William Road. He was 41, tall and slim, and wore thick framed glasses. He had suffered tuberculosis as a teenager, which required an extended period of recuperation in a sanatorium near Melbourne, but from which he made a full recovery. The illness certainly did not necessitate the removal of a lung, which has become almost myth in the recounting of the Duncan story. He had been christened George, but from an early age his mother insisted he be called by his second name, Ian. That is another correction of the record. He was Dr. Ian Duncan. He had spurned the love of an older female friend, an organist and music teacher called Dorothy Glover, who shared his deep Anglo-Catholic faith. This was revealed in his cruel letter to her, together with her imploring letters to him, which were found in his personal papers. They also included the membership card of a London club, the Gay Time Friendship Society, and several early copies of an international gay travel guide, Spartacus, which listed gay bars and outside cruising spaces in Adelaide, including the one where he would be killed. The community was appalled by the murder of someone as respected as a university lecturer, especially when rumours started to surface that members of the Vice Squad may be implicated. Another man, Roger James, was thrown into the Torrens during the attack and broke his ankle. He said that a group of men wearing suits or coats were involved, and that when he tried to get out, he had been pushed back in. When he called out that the other man, that is Duncan, was drowning, one of the attackers stripped to his underwear and plunged into the river but could not find him, and the group fled. James crawled in agony up to Victoria Drive and was taken to hospital by a passing motorist. In a grisly connection, the driver was Bevan Spencer von Einem, who was convicted in 1984 of the murder of Adelaide teenager Richard Kelvin. And this is von Einem coming into the inquest, and he looks even creepy, I think, back in 1972. The drowning was quickly picked up by the local press. Over a period of 10 weeks, it appeared on the front page of the three main Adelaide newspapers on 31 occasions. And I want you to look especially at this image. I need my glasses to do so. This is front page of the Advertiser in the days when it was a broadsheet. If you opened it up, they were doing verbatim reporting of the inquest, so it sometimes covered whole pages. But here's this incredible aerial photo. I assume they've sent someone up on a helicopter. And this is the beat. And you'll see number 9 there, which is the men's lavatory. You shouldn't think that the beat is just the toilet. This beat spread from Adelaide Bridge or City Bridge the whole way to the footbridge and sometimes past the footbridge, and from the water up to Victoria Drive. And the key thing is Duncan drowned at number 2. He wasn't thrown off the bridge. He was just shy of the intersection of Kintore Avenue coming down to Victoria Drive. But a really powerful front page Advertiser story. And here you have the wonderful revelation because it was actually a policeman who was there that night and who met one of the Vice Squad officers and who came forward and told his superiors, and that's how the case was investigated properly within the police. But as fabulous as that was, it was the reporting of a national newspaper called Review which revealed the wider implications of Duncan's death. And this was earlier. It correctly identified the place of murder as a beat, and a beat is a covert meeting place for homosexuals. It was in fact known as the number 1 beat and had operated from before 1910, so a long history. The review also pointed to regular police harassment of homosexuals involving the use of agents provocateurs, decoy policemen whose job was entrapment, and claimed that the killers had escaped in a vehicle that had later been identified as an unmarked police car. In a bold move, Professor Luca wrote to the police commissioner asking what steps were being taken to reassure the public of the integrity of the police force. His letter was published by The Advertiser, together with its own editorial, which stated that, quote, "There is a feeling abroad that investigations into Dr. Duncan's death have not been pressed with sufficient vigour," unquote. This raised the stakes for the government, and Attorney General Len King called for a police report before ordering a coronial inquest. The Duncan case garnered publicity mainly because he was a member of a respected profession and one related to the law, and because the University of Adelaide, particularly through the dedicated advocacy of Professor Luca, who attended every day of the inquest, continued to pursue the case. And Horst is still alive, and I think 92 up in Brisbane, and still working, and he's an extraordinary man. On the opening day of the inquest, the state's head of pathology who carried out the autopsy, Dr. Colin Manock, said that his examination of Duncan's body indicated that he had been a passive homosexual. This was because Duncan had a funnel-shaped anus. The Advertiser could not bring itself to describe Duncan's anal characteristics, but as a student journalist remarked, quote, "It is chilling to realise that the law can accept the definition of homosexuality in purely pathological terms," unquote. And no doubt you would be aware that Manock's findings have been challenged in a number of cases, most notably that of Henry Keogh. The linking of homosexuality with anal and other defects can be traced back to an 1857 book by a French doctor. This archaic text, now discredited, equated homosexuality with deformed physiology. Possibly it was what Manock was taught at medical school. Certainly it was not questioned at the inquest. When the coroner eventually brought down his findings, he used this evidence from Manock to conclude that Duncan was a homosexual, and which became the accepted wisdom about his sexuality. This combined with early reporting about Duncan to create or confirm an unfortunate stereotype, the bookish, timid, sickly, lonely homosexual who prowled around toilet blocks in search of sexual gratification. Roger James, the sole witness to the Duncan drowning, stated at the inquest that he was unable to identify the attackers, and here he is appearing. Another man whose name was protected but was called Mr. X, who you would have heard in what we've just seen, who'd been thrown into the river half an hour before Duncan and James, also could not identify the men who assaulted him. And you saw those steps, and in fact he was thrown down those steps twice, and then he was thrown into the river. It was incredibly brutal, the attack on Mr. X. He was married and only came forward when he was traced, his car registration number was traced. Mr. X was one of 4 witnesses for whom Premier Dunstan had promised government protection, including full anonymity and immunity from prosecution, given that they may have been engaging that night in what then were criminal acts. On 29 June, just over 7 weeks after the drowning, Constables Francis John Corley, have a good look at them, and Michael Kenneth Clayton refused to answer questions put to them at the inquest on the grounds they could be incriminated. The following day, they and he's on the right, his lawyers on the left, Senior Constable Brian Edwin Hudson were suspended from the police force. Within 10 days, all of them had resigned. When the coroner brought down his open finding, he concluded that all three were no closer than 300 yards from where Duncan died. And again, another full-page front story, this time in the news. And in a further macabre connection, Mr. X was represented at the inquest by Derrance Stevenson. I think I've gone forward, seen here on the left, who would be killed by his young boyfriend in 1979 in the infamous body in the freezer case. Public concern about the Duncan case was so great that Premier Dunstan accepted the advice of his new police commissioner, Harold Salisbury, to invite 2 detectives from New Scotland Yard to reinvestigate. And when I was at Writers' Week with David Marr, he took one look at this photo and he said, "That man on the left is a drunk." And I think he probably was right. Their report, which would not be released for another 30 years, described Duncan's death in extraordinary terms as, quote, merely a high-spirited frolic which went wrong, unquote. It also revealed that the detectives believed the 3 Vice Squad officers were guilty, but the Crown solicitor had decided there was insufficient evidence to prosecute. The report's authors returned to Britain, carrying with them a bizarre plaque from SA Police, which marked the pleasant association between the 2 forces. Incredibly, this plaque found its way back to an Adelaide auction house and has since been donated to the archives of the University of Adelaide. One of the New Scotland Yard detectives was later jailed for 3 years for tax evasion and the other for 7 years for running a pornography protection racket. These developments could hardly be seen as inspiring confidence in their work on the Duncan case. What followed were various unheeded calls over the decades for a royal commission. The case went cold until 1985, when a former Vice Squad member, Mick O'Shea, came forward with claims of a police cover-up. Subsequently, Cawley and Clayton were charged with Duncan's manslaughter and brought to trial. There's Cawley, there's Clayton, obviously a bit older. They were acquitted. Hudson was found to have no case to answer. In 1990, a report from a police task force was tabled in the South Australian Parliament. It recommended no further action unless new evidence was forthcoming, and there, essentially, the matter has rested. Don Dunstan has said that the case likely would only be solved when someone with a guilty conscience came forward. I think he was right, but I also believe, deathbed confessions aside, it is unlikely that will come to pass. Back to 1972, however, for amid all the commotion about the case, there had been, obviously, this unexpected and dramatic development. 2 weeks after the inquest had commenced, a group calling itself the Moral Freedom Committee wrote an open letter to South Australian parliamentarians urging decriminalisation. They said, quote, "The question of homosexual behaviour is a moral matter and therefore not the law's business. The law does not punish fornication and adultery. It should not punish homosexual behaviour," unquote. Then the Advertiser printed an editorial headed "Legalise Homosexuality," arguing that, quote, "the state has no business in its citizens' bedrooms, and the sooner it is completely removed from them, the better," unquote. The Advertiser was a very progressive newspaper at that time, nothing like today. and pursued decriminalisation right through to its eventual success. The editorial certainly was potent stuff and helpful, as the previous year had seen the establishment of a local chapter of a gay and lesbian group called CAMP, an acronym for Campaign Against Moral Persecution, whose members were committed to advancing law reform. The Duncan case suddenly was dropping the issue straight into their laps. Yet, as you have just seen, the editorial was topped 5 days later by an announcement from a member of the upper house, Murray Hill. Crucially, Hill was a member of the Liberal and Country League Party, the conservative side of politics, then in opposition against the Labor Party headed by Don Dunstan. Hill revealed that he would prepare a private member's bill, to enact decriminalisation, something that not even the Labor Party had been able to achieve, and which eventually was introduced within 11 weeks of Duncan's death. Very significant. Hill was very clear that his legislation would, quote, seek to protect the privacy only of those people who live together, unquote, and, quote, certainly would not seek to put the seal of moral approval on homosexuality as such, nor would it condone this sort of behaviour, unquote. It seemed that two homosexual men may finally be able to have sex without intrusion into the privacy of their own homes, but they should not forget they were social outcasts. This is not to criticise Hill, who very likely was trying to make the bill palatable to members of his own side of politics, and from whom he probably was coming under intense scrutiny. You have heard the astonishing question put to him by the ABC journalist, "You're not a homosexual yourself." Hill didn't flinch before answering in the negative. He was married with a family, one child of whom was Robert, a junior solicitor who would help draft the bill and go on to a career in federal politics, I think in defence. Murray Hill demonstrated courage and leadership, and I argue is the hero of the piece in relation to the law reform events of 1972. The bill was based on that introduced into the British Parliament in 1967. It would allow consensual sexual acts in private between two men, and as he said, two men only, over the age of 21, even though the legal age of adulthood in the state was 18. It was not a charter for gay liberation, and very unlike the 1975 bill, which created full legal parity for all, regardless of sexuality. Camp lobbied hard for the bill, but saw it only as an interim measure. They hoped that a recently announced committee to examine the state's penal code and to be chaired by Justice later Dame Roma Mitchell would recommend wider reform. They knew they would be confronting major opposition in the notoriously conservative Legislative Council, which was controlled by the Liberal and Country League Party. Even though parliamentarians on both sides were to be allowed a conscience vote, the Labor Party under Dunstan's stewardship indicated that the bill would have an easy run in the House of Assembly, the lower house, which it controlled. However, Camp was also aware that religious groups like the Community Standards Organisation, Moral Action Committee and Moral Rearmament, there was so much morality going on at that time, were working to defeat the bill. The Catholic Church was opposed, but the Anglican, Congregational and Methodist churches had indicated their support. Camp also had the local Council for Civil Liberties and Humanist Society on side, some of whose members had formed the Moral Freedom Committee, which is the committee that wrote that first letter. And they're using morality but in a different way. This is the group mentioned by Murray Hill in the ABC story and generously in his introductory speech to Parliament. Again, it was a strategic move by Hill, as lauding gay rights activists during this process would have been anathema to his Conservative colleagues. Nevertheless, Duncan's death and the resultant bill had happened so quickly that Camp had limited time not just to lobby, but to educate members of Parliament about this bold piece of social legislation. This became apparent as parliamentary debate commenced, with even those in support delivering speeches which only served to stigmatise further an already marginalised group. Murray Hill resorted to clunky metaphor when he referred to, quote, these odd men out, these men with a limp who wait for help on the roadside of life, unquote. I don't know who wrote that rubbish. Another parliamentarian declared that, quote, like alcoholism, mental derangement and adultery, this is not a palatable subject to discuss, unquote. The Catholic Attorney General Len King said male homosexual acts were a perverted activity and intrinsically evil, even though he voted for the bill. Parliamentarians who spoke against took a harder line. They argued that it could be seen as making homosexuality socially acceptable and thus lead to an increase in its prevalence, especially among young people. There were even fears expressed presciently as it transpired that homosexual marriage would follow, though that Member of Parliament gave it only 10 years. In reality, it was 45 years away. Parliamentarians were inundated with letters from the public, and so were the media. Of many letters to the editor published by the Advertiser on the subject, those in favour were overwhelmed by those against, who mainly justified their position using religious arguments. Anne E. Joyce said, quote, God, in his holy word, has set down moral rules for mankind, and if man deliberately and defiantly disobeys, then he will destroy himself, unquote. Mary Jonatz read the story at breakfast and declared, quote, I could not swallow my food nor the bill, unquote. But Margaret Ferry called the scriptures, quote, an historical account of bygone centuries, unquote, and asked, quote, surely there is such a thing as progress and reform, unquote. She was backed up by Camp's Roger Knight, who argued that the views of Old Testament fundamentalists should not be, quote, the basis for lawmaking in a secular society, unquote. Camp was busy working behind the scenes to get the bill passed, but not all homophile groups supported it. The more revolutionary Gay Liberation, for example, argued that only full legal equality for homosexuals was acceptable, describing the bill as, quote, totally inadequate and probably even dangerous, unquote. The bill was passed within 3 months, but with an amendment which meant that full decriminalisation was not achieved. The amendment had been introduced by Ren de Garis, the leader of the Conservatives in the Legislative Council, who had written to Camp warning of the social evils stemming from homosexuality, and there's that evil word again. The change meant that a private consensual sexual act between two men over the age of 21 would exist only as a defence in court. It was a brilliant but cruel political tactic. It allowed for a measure of reform, inevitable and perhaps even necessary after the death of Dr Duncan, but meant that homosexual men could still be dragged before the courts with the attendant publicity. The bill bounced back between the upper and lower houses of Parliament as various other amendments were introduced and rejected. Labor stuck to its promise as the bill was debated in under 4 hours in the House of Assembly and opposed only by Liberal and Country League members. But it was clear that the Legislative Council would never pass the bill in its original form, and Camp realised that the De Garis amendment, while highly unsatisfactory, would be an improvement on the previous draconian legislation. And with 7 of the 10 Legislative Councillors who voted against the bill up for re-election in March 1973, a further attempt at decriminalisation could be made. And indeed, 6 months after the election, Labor's newly elected Peter Duncan introduced a completely different and trailblazing bill. This provided for a code of sexual behaviour applicable to all persons regardless of gender or sexual orientation. It established a common age of consent of 17, the same penalties for non-consenting acts, and the same restrictions on and penalties for public acts. It abolished the offences of buggery, gross indecency, and soliciting for homosexual purposes, but for the first time recognised male prostitution and homosexual rape. But in the middle of parliamentary debate, the Advertiser reported that a new group called Gay Activists Alliance planned to give talks on homosexuality to South Australian leaving and matriculation students. GAA's mandate was far more radical than Camp's reformist approach. This issue erupted in the Legislative Council, with members claiming that GAA was concerned not with educating young people, but trying to convert them. The bill was on a knife's edge, but still would have passed, except that it was defeated when a Labor Legislative councillor who claimed he had not heard the bells ringing for the division failed to vote. It was reintroduced for a second reading the following week under a rarely used standing order. This all gets very complex, but a new law granting a deliberative vote to the President of the Council, Sir Lyle McEwen, left the fate of the bill in his hands. The 76-year-old McEwen was not known as a supporter of progressive courses, and the bill lapsed on a tied vote, defeated for the second and last time. Nearly there. After the 1975 election, however, the representation of the Legislative Council changed significantly under a more democratic electoral system. 3 opponents of law reform, including McEwen, left the chamber and 8 new members entered, 6 of them Labor. The state of the parties was now Labor 10, Liberal, which had renamed itself from Liberal and Country League, 9, and Liberal Movement, an offshoot of the Liberals, 2. A bill almost identical to that of 1973, and that's what it looked like, was introduced within the month by Peter Duncan, who was soon to be appointed Attorney General, which attracted immediate opposition from a new religious lobby group, the Festival of Light. But an unexpected player, the newly appointed Anglican Archbishop of Adelaide, entered the arena by giving qualified support to law reform in a wide-ranging pastoral address to his first diocesan synod. The Advertiser immediately gave it prominence in a page 1 article headed "Archbishop Favours Move." With support now offered by representatives of the Anglican, Catholic, Congregational and Methodist denominations, the Festival of Light was directly challenged in its claim that it represented the unanimous Christian view. The bill sailed through the lower house in a single sitting, supported by all Labor members and the new leaders of the Liberal and Liberal Movement parties. In her introductory speech in the upper house, Labor's Anne Levy was able to list in detail the influential churches, community groups, newspapers, political and professional organisations, and vitally, public polls that now supported the legislation. Momentum was building for change, helped by the fact that, unlike 1973, gay activists were not involved in contentious lobbying. Finally, The bill was passed on 17 September 1975 with gubernatorial assent the following day. It became law on the 25th when, as noted, South Australia led the nation and English-speaking world. A shocking murder had been the trigger for pioneering legislative change, although it is worth emphasising again that all three decriminalisation bills were introduced as private members' bills. None of them had the formal backing of a political party. It should also be noted that this was not necessarily the beginning of South Australia taking the lead nationally in relation to gay law reform. In 2020, the state abolished the so-called gay panic provocation defence, and it was the last Australian jurisdiction to do so. And I acknowledge the work of Professor Williams and his colleagues at the Law Reform Institute who recommended that government take action. So I'm at the end. I want to conclude by telling you about the Dr Duncan Memorial Scholarship. In 2015, the University of Adelaide established this annual award to support an undergraduate student doing a Bachelor of Laws program, and which was launched by the former High Court Judge, the Honourable Michael Kirby, AC CMG. Selection of the successful candidate is made according to financial need and a demonstrated commitment to LGBTIQ issues. There is a leaflet about the scholarship on shares, and I invite you to consider making a donation to this worthy cause. So, it has been my pleasure to talk to you tonight about this dark but transformational episode in South Australia's history. I'm supposed to be saying I'll be happy to take questions, but I have 2 minutes to do that, and then I'll be available to sign books from 6:30. At 7 o'clock, Dr Gertrude Glossop's sold-out walking tour will commence in the Napier Building forecourt, but if you missed out, there is another tour this Sunday at 11 a.m. At 7:15 tonight, and I do hope you can come to this, it is included in Gertrude's tour, there will be a free concert of 2 songs from the recent Adelaide Festival oratorio Watershed, The Death of Dr Duncan, at the university's Victoria Drive entrance. And one of the songs is the Drowning Song for Ian, which I just sob every time I hear it. Everyone here is invited to attend this event. Thank you.